15-year-old boy saved plane from crashing. 24 hours later, he received a shocking presidential invitation. Ethan Rivera sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, surrounded by pieces of a half-built model airplane. Before we go further, please ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more interesting stories like this one. Ethan Rivera sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, surrounded by pieces of a half-built model airplane. The evening sun filtered through the blinds, casting amber stripes across the aviation posters plastered over his walls, each one a silent monument to the dream that lived quietly in his chest. The hum of his laptop, still running the latest flight simulator program, buzzed like background static, occasionally interrupted by the artificial crackle of radio chatter. Outside, the Arizona sky was fading into a deep coral hue, but Ethan barely noticed. His fingers moved deftly, gluing the delicate wing assembly together, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the simulation replay running on his screen, a mock emergency landing in crosswinds. He had landed it perfectly, just like he had 100 times before. "Dinner's ready," his mom called from the kitchen, her voice muffled by the hallway. "Just a minute," Ethan replied, not looking up. He wiped a smear of glue on his jeans and sat back on his heels, examining the model like a surgeon checking vitals. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a passion that anchored him. Some kids played sports. Others built robots or coded video games. Ethan flew. Ever since he was 9, the sky had fascinated him. While other kids were watching cartoons, Ethan was watching air crash documentaries and pausing them to sketch the control panels. While they rode bikes, he was memorizing aircraft call signs and runway markings. For his 12th birthday, his mother had saved up enough to buy him a second-hand yoke and rudder system, and he'd spent every spare moment flying simulated routes from Los Angeles to Tokyo, learning every detail about pressure, altitudes, V-speeds, and ILS landings. His dream was simple, to fly. But in a world that moved too fast and expected too much, it felt like a dream with no runway. He finally stood, stretched his stiff legs, and wandered into the kitchen. His mother, Carla, was plating up spaghetti, his favorite, and chatting on the phone with his aunt. Her voice rose in excitement as she turned to Ethan, covering the receiver. "Your cousin's graduation is next week in New York. I booked our flights. Can you believe little Natalie's already done with high school?" Ethan smiled politely and nodded. "That's great." She continued her conversation while he sat and twirled pasta around his fork, but his mind was already in the sky. He thought about the plane they'd be on. What aircraft model? What airline? Who would be the pilot? He could probably guess the cruising altitude, the average airspeed, and the arrival gate at JFK, all before takeoff. He didn't talk about it much at school. Most kids didn't get it. They thought it was weird, intense. Pilot boy, some teased. But he didn't care. In the sky, there was no judgment, just physics, precision, and peace. That night, after dinner and after his mom had gone to bed, Ethan returned to his room. The city outside was asleep, but his mind buzzed with the engine roar of imagination. He sat back at his simulator, clicked into another training scenario, and slipped on his headset. "Phoenix Tower, this is N194 EV requesting clearance for takeoff. Runway 25, right?" he said softly to himself. He mimicked the controller's reply and guided his virtual Cessna onto the pixelated runway. The familiar beeping of his altitude indicator filled the room as he throttled up and lifted off into the simulated night sky. The blue glow of the monitor washed over his face, making his wide brown eyes look even more serious than usual. His mother often told him he had an old soul, and it wasn't hard to see why. While most teens were out scrolling, streaming, or shouting on multiplayer games, Ethan was practicing emergency landings in low visibility. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. 2 hours later, the plane was parked, the simulation logged, and Ethan finally crawled into bed. He stared at the ceiling, the flight replay looping in his head. Every movement he made, every course correction, every call-out, was calculated, deliberate. He didn't think he was extraordinary. In fact, he often worried he wasn't enough. Not cool enough. Not outgoing enough. Just a kid with a head full of jet fuel and no real place to fly. But somewhere deep down, he believed maybe someday he'd get the chance to do something important. The next morning, the sun crept in early and bright. Ethan woke to the sound of his mom packing snacks into their travel bag. Their flight was scheduled for the afternoon. He took a long shower, packed his laptop, a book on aircraft communication systems, and his noise-canceling headphones. At the airport, The crowds buzzed with that electric mix of excitement and exhaustion. He watched the planes take off through the glass wall at the gate, tracking their taxi paths like a chessboard in motion. Once they boarded, Ethan chose the window seat and immediately identified the aircraft, an Airbus A321. Twin engines. Narrow body. Comfortable cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. He smiled. For most people, this was just transportation. But for him, every flight was a front-row seat to magic. As the engines roared to life and the plane lifted off the ground, Ethan pressed his head gently against the window, watching the shrinking buildings below. He didn't know that above the clouds, fate had other plans. He didn't know that the man in the cockpit would later collapse midair, that voices would scream and chaos would reign, that he, of all people, would have to rise. He didn't know yet that this was not just another flight. It was the beginning of everything. The hum of the engines was steady, rhythmic, like a giant heartbeat that lulled passengers into mid-flight calm. The sky outside was a deep ocean blue, tinged with clouds the color of crushed pearls. Ethan leaned his forehead against the cool window, watching the sun wink through layers of mist. The Airbus A321 soared at 32,000 feet, cutting through the atmosphere like a blade. The seatbelt sign was off. Flight attendants moved down the aisle offering drinks. Laughter, keyboard clicks, soft music through earbuds. Everything was routine. Then, the first jolt came. Subtle, but enough to snap Ethan out of his trance. The plane shuddered, not a normal bump. He looked up, eyes narrowing. Another jolt followed, sharper this time, and trays rattled slightly in passengers' laps. A few nervous murmurs. A flight attendant paused mid-step, gripping the overhead bin for balance. Ethan's fingers curled around his armrest. He'd studied turbulence patterns, weather systems. Something felt off. The captain's voice came over the speaker, unusually clipped. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering unexpected turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated." That was normal, but the tone wasn't. Ethan sat back, tightened his belt. He noticed the flight attendant whispering to a colleague near the galley, her face pale. The plane dipped again, more sudden this time, and gasps rang out across the cabin. Cups spilled. A baby began to cry. Then silence. The plane stabilized, but only for a moment. A low, grinding noise echoed from beneath, followed by a sensation Ethan had only experienced in simulations, a slight but unmistakable loss of lift. His heart thudded as he glanced at the emergency card in front of him, as if it could explain what was happening. A minute passed, then 5. No updates, no reassurances, only the sound of wind outside and a strange quiet tension inside. Then a flight attendant rushed down the aisle toward the cockpit. The other stood frozen in place, her hand trembling as she clutched the intercom. "Medical personnel to the front," she called out shakily. "If there's a doctor on board, please come forward immediately." Ethan turned to his mom. Her lips parted, but no words came. The man across the aisle muttered, "What the hell is going on?" Another passenger unbuckled, only to be firmly told to sit down. Panic was beginning to spread like fire in a dry field. Moments later, the flight attendant returned, visibly shaken. She leaned toward a crew member and whispered something that made the woman's knees nearly buckle. The word "collapsed" floated down the aisle, carried like ash on the wind. The pilot had gone down. The plane dipped again, a subtle shift in angle but terrifying in its implications. Ethan's ears popped, his chest tightened. This wasn't just turbulence. Something was terribly wrong. "Is there a co-pilot?" A passenger yelled from the back. But there was no answer. And then the plane began a slow, uneven descent. Ethan felt it in his bones, the yaw, the uneven banking, the sluggish response. His flight hours in simulators had taught him to recognize control instability. The aircraft was flying, but barely. He turned to his mother, and for the first time in years, she saw real fear in his eyes, not fear for himself, but fear for everyone. He stood. The seatbelt light glared red above him, but he ignored it. "Ethan," his mother hissed, grabbing his wrist. "I need to try," he said. "Trust me." Before she could protest, he moved toward the galley where 2 crew members were huddled, whispering over a headset. They jumped as he approached, unsure what a teenager was doing out of his seat. "I can help," Ethan said, his voice clear but urgent. "I know this aircraft. I've trained in simulators. If there's no pilot." One of them tried to brush him off, but the desperation in Ethan's face gave them pause. "We're speaking to ATC now," the older attendant said, fumbling with the headset. Ethan took a deep breath. "Put me on." For a moment, they hesitated. But chaos demands courage, and with no one else to turn to, she handed him the headset. "This is Flight 486, Airbus A321, Ethan said into the mic, his voice shaking but determined. "We've lost our pilot. I need immediate instruction." The voice on the other end crackled with disbelief. "Who am I speaking with? I'm a civilian, 15 years old. I've logged over 500 hours in A321 flight simulators. I can read your instructions. Just help me keep us in the air." There was a pause, heavy and long. Then the voice responded, "Copy that. Stay calm. We're going to walk you through this." From there, everything moved in a strange, time-slowed blur. Ethan relayed messages, adjusted flaps, watched the instrument panel over the shoulder of the emergency crew member who sat, sweating and terrified, at the controls. Together, they stabilized the descent, correcting the plane's angle and managing the auto-throttle. Ethan spoke in short, sharp bursts. Speed brake extended. Altitude stable. Heading 310. His hands shook, but his mind was focused like a laser. The plane leveled. A collective gasp filled the cabin. Someone began to pray. Others wept. Ethan didn't notice any of it. His entire world was numbers, dials, and altitude readings. Minutes turned to an hour. The runway at JFK was cleared. Emergency vehicles lined the tarmac. "Final approach," the voice in his ear said. The plane trembled slightly on descent, but the landing gear deployed. The crew followed Ethan's guidance. Every word rooted in years of silent study. When the wheels touched down and the aircraft screeched along the runway, the entire cabin erupted in cheers, screams, and applause. But Ethan didn't react. He sat down in a jump seat, his eyes wide, his breathing uneven. He had done it. The plane was on the ground. Lives were saved. But his hands wouldn't stop shaking. The flight attendant knelt beside him. "You just saved 200 people. Ethan looked up at her. His voice was barely audible. "I was just trying to land." And above them, in the sky they just escaped, the sun broke through the clouds like a promise. The airport terminal was a sea of flashing lights and muffled chaos. Emergency responders surrounded the plane before the wheels even cooled. Passengers, still shaking, filed out one by one into the cold jet bridge, greeted by blankets, questions, and medics. Some clutched one another as if they might float away if they let go. Others looked dazed, their brains still midair, not quite registering the miracle they had just survived. Ethan stepped off the aircraft last, his hand gripped tightly by his mother's. Her eyes hadn't left him since the moment he took the headset. Now, as cameras angled toward them, she instinctively pulled him closer, trying to shield him. But it was too late. The story had already taken flight. Word had spread fast. Before the plane even touched the runway, tower chatter leaked. "Teen boy saved Flight 486, someone tweeted. A flight attendant's cousin worked at a news station, and by the time Ethan's feet hit the ground, the headlines were everywhere. 15-year-old guides plane to safety after pilot collapses midair. Teen hero at 30,000 feet. Miracle in the sky, led by a high school student." The press crowded outside the terminal as if waiting for a celebrity, not a teenager in a wrinkled hoodie. Microphones extended like spears, lights flared, and questions flew faster than the plane ever had. "Ethan, what were you thinking when the pilot collapsed? How did you know what to do? Were you scared? Do you want to be a pilot now? Do you realize you saved hundreds of lives?" He didn't answer. Couldn't. He stood there, blank-faced, the weight of it all only beginning to press down. He hadn't done it for glory or headlines. He didn't even know what he'd done yet. His knees ached from the hours of tension, his voice was raw from speaking into the radio, and his head buzzed with everything he'd heard through that headset, commands, checklist, survival. By the time he and his mother were escorted to a quiet side room, his hands were trembling again. She poured him a cup of water and knelt beside him, brushing his hair back the way she did when he was little. "You did good, baby," she whispered. "You brought us home." He looked at her, eyes rimmed with fatigue. "I thought we were going to die." She hugged him hard, and for the first time since the ordeal began, Ethan let go. His body shook silently, not in fear anymore, but release. Not even tears, just breath, all the breath he hadn't dared take since the sky turned on them. Hours passed. They were questioned by airline officials, emergency investigators, and even a man from the FAA. Each conversation bled into the next. Reporters camped outside the airport hotel where they were put up for the night. The phones never stopped ringing. That night, in the dark of their hotel room, Ethan sat awake while his mother slept. The TV droned on in the background, looping footage of JFK's emergency landing. He watched the replay of their plane touching down. How smooth it looked from outside. How impossible that calm had felt inside. The news anchor kept calling him the miracle kid, the unlikely hero, the aviation prodigy. But Ethan didn't feel like any of those things. He felt hollow, like the gravity hadn't quite caught up with him. He clicked off the TV, rolled over, and stared at the ceiling. His thoughts ran in loops. The pilot's body slumped, the voice in his headset, the numbers flashing on the console. He hadn't meant to be a hero. He hadn't even hesitated. He just acted. Because someone had to. In the morning, they were scheduled to continue on to upstate New York for Natalie's graduation, but it was clear that wasn't going to happen. At breakfast, a hotel staffer handed his mother a note with trembling hands. "Someone's trying to reach you," she said quietly. From Washington. Ethan's mother unfolded the paper. It bore a presidential seal. Her eyes widened. "Ethan," she said, barely above a whisper. "The White House called." He blinked. "What?" "They want to speak to you." "Someone from the president's staff. A senior advisor." He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the note. His name was printed clearly, Ethan Rivera, followed by a direct line. It didn't feel real. Just 24 hours ago, he was in his room building model planes. Now, Washington? The call came later that afternoon. A woman's voice on the other end, warm but formal. "Mr. Rivera, I'm calling on behalf of the President of the United States. He was deeply moved by your actions yesterday. Your courage inspired him and many others across the country. The President would like to invite you to the White House." Ethan didn't speak. His mother had to take the phone. "Yes, thank you. Yes, we'll make arrangements," she said, voice steady though her hands shook. They hung up, and for a long moment, the room was still. "I don't understand," Ethan said finally. "Why me? I'm just a kid." His mother looked at him, really looked, and smiled. "That's exactly why." That night, they didn't turn on the TV. They sat side by side in the quiet, eating hotel microwave popcorn and watching the planes take off in the distance. Ethan followed each one with his eyes, no longer just a dreamer on the ground. The world had seen what he could do, and for the first time, he started to believe it too. The day began like a dream someone else might have. The kind of dream you wake from before the good part begins. But Ethan Rivera wasn't dreaming. The motorcade was real, the black SUVs waiting outside the hotel were real, and so were the two Secret Service agents who addressed him by name as they opened the door. "Ethan, we're ready for you." He glanced at his mother, whose proud but terrified smile mirrored the storm of emotions swirling in his chest. She squeezed his hand once before he climbed into the vehicle. The city passed by in blurred streaks of steel and stone as they drove. It was only his second time in Washington, D.C., but nothing looked the same as before. Back then, he'd been just another tourist with a backpack and a map. Now, he was the boy who landed a plane. The boy the president wanted to meet. Security at the White House was swift and quiet. Polished marble floors reflected the soft click of their footsteps as they walked through the West Wing, each step echoing louder than the last. Ethan's palms were damp. He wiped them on his pants more times than he could count, eyes darting around the corridors lined with portraits and history. He passed by the Roosevelt Room, the Cabinet Room, and then finally, the Oval Office. A man in a tailored Navy suit opened the door. "Mr. President, Ethan Rivera is here." And there he was. The president stood, his expression warm, his hand outstretched. He looked different in person. Older, yes, but kinder too, like a grandfather who carried the weight of the world with grace. "Ethan," he said, gripping his hand firmly, "I've been waiting to meet you. You've given this country something it desperately needed, a reason to believe in courage again." Ethan, frozen for a moment, finally managed to speak. "Thank you, sir. I was just doing what I thought I had to." The president gestured for him to sit. "That's what heroes say." They talked. Not about politics, not about media headlines or public appearances. They talked about airplanes. About how Ethan had memorized the Airbus A321's layout, about the simulator hours he'd logged on a hand-me-down desktop. The president, a former military man himself, leaned in with genuine interest. He asked Ethan to walk him through the landing, what he saw, what he felt. Ethan explained as best he could, occasionally glancing at the American flag behind the desk, still unsure if this moment was real. Then came the press. Cameras clicked like machine gun fire as Ethan stood beside the president in the Rose Garden, sunlight casting golden halos on their shoulders. The press secretary introduced him not as a child, not even as a teenager, but as a brave young American who saved hundreds with composure beyond his years. The crowd of reporters waited, silent. The president turned to him. "Would you like to say something, Ethan?" The microphone loomed before him, but somehow he wasn't afraid. He cleared his throat and looked out at the sea of faces, cameras, and curiosity. "I didn't think. I just knew what needed to happen. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. I didn't know if I could do it, but I had to try. That's all." There was no applause, just silence. A sacred, shared stillness, as if everyone there recognized the purity in his words. And then, one clap, then another, and another, until the rose garden filled with thunderous appreciation, and Ethan stood beneath the weight of it all, humbled, blinking back the emotion that welled behind his eyes. Later, the president gifted him a commemorative coin, engraved with the words, "For courage in the skies." His mother joined them then, the president thanking her for raising a son with unshakable moral instinct. She cried quietly, clutching Ethan's hand the whole time. After the ceremony, they were taken on a private tour of the residence. Ethan marveled at the paintings, the worn banisters, the creaking wood that had witnessed generations of power and decisions. But none of it dazzled him as much as the quiet moment in the East Room, when he stood alone for a second, staring at a painting of Abraham Lincoln. He wondered if Lincoln ever felt like a normal kid once. If he ever sat in the quiet of his room, afraid the world might be too big for him. That evening, as the sun lowered over the city, casting a soft glow across the National Mall, Ethan sat on a bench just outside the South Lawn. The day had been overwhelming, surreal, but he wasn't lost in the spectacle. He was thinking about the flight, about the people, about how close they'd all come to dying, and how he'd somehow made sure they didn't. A soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Do you realize how rare it is, what you did?" It was the president again, alone now, his suit jacket off, sleeves rolled, a cup of coffee in hand. Ethan shook his head. "I didn't think it would matter to anyone. I mean, I'm not trained or anything. I just practiced a lot." The president nodded. "That's the thing about training. It's not always about certificates or titles. Sometimes it's about instinct. When no one else stood up, you did. That matters." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the wind gently tugging at the trees around them. "I've met generals who wouldn't have stayed that calm," the president added, sipping his coffee. "You didn't wait for someone to tell you it was okay to lead. You just led." Ethan looked down at his hands. "I was terrified. Leadership doesn't mean fearlessness," the president said. "It means doing the right thing despite it." When they returned to the hotel that night, Ethan took off the suit jacket, undid his tie, and stood in front of the mirror. He barely recognized the reflection, not because he looked different, but because for the first time, he didn't feel like a boy trying to be something. He felt like someone who already was. The morning sun filtered through Ethan's bedroom window just as it always had, casting golden rays across the same cluttered desk, the same unfinished model planes, and the same worn flight manuals scattered like a paper runway. But nothing about this morning felt ordinary. His suitcase still sat half unpacked in the corner, the presidential seal stamped boldly on the side of an envelope sticking out of the front pocket. He hadn't touched it since returning home, not because he didn't care, but because some part of him was still trying to understand it all. He stood in front of the mirror brushing his teeth, staring at himself like he was a stranger. Not much had changed on the outside. Same dark, thoughtful eyes. Same messy hair. Same slight curve of nervousness in his shoulders. But on the inside, something had shifted. Permanently. He had walked into that flight a passenger. He returned home something else entirely. School resumed the following week, and Ethan did everything in his power to slip back into normal life. But the world wasn't going to let him. Kids who once ignored him in the hallways now stared with wide-eyed admiration. Some asked for selfies. Others shoved questions into his face between classes. About planes, about the president, about whether it was all real. Teachers gave him knowing nods and extended deadlines. The principal requested he speak at an assembly. But Ethan wasn't interested in being famous. He wanted to understand why fate had chosen that moment, that plane, him. Not because he didn't feel proud, he did, but because it was such a narrow edge to walk. One decision, one breath. If he had hesitated even for a second, everything could have ended differently. And yet, he hadn't. He had listened. He had trusted himself. Weeks passed. The buzz began to settle, But the story lived on online, in newspapers, on late-night talk shows. A senator mentioned him in a speech about investing in youth STEM programs. A scholarship fund was created in his name for aspiring aviators under 18. Universities he'd never applied to began sending packages with notes like, "We'd love to be your runway." Still, Ethan stayed quiet. Grateful, but quiet. Then, one Friday afternoon, he visited the local community center, a low building with faded paint and scuffed tile floors, the kind of place where kids went after school because they had nowhere else to go. It had always been part of the neighborhood, like background music, but he'd never stepped inside before. He did that day, and everything changed again. Inside, he found a dusty back room with broken desks and an old whiteboard. The director, a soft-spoken woman named Ms. Harris, smiled when she saw him. "I was hoping you'd come," she said. "The kids can't stop talking about you." Ethan glanced around, unsure. "I was thinking, maybe I could show them what I do? The simulators? Teach them some basics." Her smile deepened. "I think that's exactly what they need." By the following week, Ethan had brought in his own setup, old laptop, yoke, rudder pedals. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. He taught his first session to a room of 5 curious kids. By the next week, there were 12. A month later, the center had applied for a grant to expand the program. Ethan named it Wings and Waiting. It wasn't about creating pilots. It was about showing kids what was possible when someone believed in them, even if that someone was just themselves. One day, as he guided a nervous 11-year-old named Mason through a mock takeoff, he watched the boy's eyes light up as the simulated plane lifted into the digital sky. "I'm flying," Mason whispered. "You are," Ethan replied. "You really are." Those were the moments that mattered. Not the cameras, not the applause, but the quiet spark of discovery. At night, he sometimes sat outside on the roof with his mother, both wrapped in old blankets, sipping hot cocoa. The stars above stretched endlessly, their brilliance undimmed by the city glow. "You ever think about that flight?" she asked one night. "Every day," Ethan admitted. "Not the fear, though. Not anymore. I think about what it showed me, about who I want to be." She nodded, proud but silent. Words weren't always needed between them. Months passed, then nearly a year. On the anniversary of the flight, Ethan received another envelope. This one simpler, without the formality or golden crest. Just a small card with a short note written in blue ink. "A year ago, you reminded us what bravery looks like. I hope you never stop listening to that voice inside you. Keep flying. Jr." There was no signature, but he didn't need one. He knew exactly who it was from. He framed the card and placed it above his desk, just beside his old simulation monitor. It wasn't there for bragging rights. It was there to remind him that one moment, one decision, could ripple through hundreds of lives, and that courage doesn't always look like capes or medals. Sometimes it looks like a 15-year-old boy, standing up in the middle of panic and saying, "I can help." One evening, as he left the community center, he paused on the sidewalk. A plane roared overhead, its red lights blinking against the dusk. Ethan watched it disappear into the horizon, smiled faintly, and whispered to himself, "I know exactly where you're going." Then he walked home, not as the boy who saved a plane, not as the kid the world cheered for, but as Ethan Rivera, the one who discovered, in the middle of freefall, just how much he was capable of. And the sky was still waiting. If you enjoyed this story, ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing, heartfelt stories like this. Also, let us know where you're watching from and drop your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing from you. What did you think of Ethan Rivera's bravery and how his mother supported him every step of the way? Were you inspired by the president's recognition of his courage or by Mason's first flight in the community center? This story reminds us that age doesn't define heroism. Let's celebrate everyday heroes like Ethan, Carla, and even young dreamers like Mason. See you in the next story.